Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion with a wonderful panel today on what you and your board need to know about the future of ESG, environment, social, and governance. I'm joined today by really an all-star panel, which I'll be introducing in just a moment. But the purpose of today's conversation is really to talk about this issue of ESG in light of all that we have been living through in 2020. This has certainly been an unusual year, and so much has happened that could impact things related to climate change and climate risk, social and society movements, and our governance structures. So we're going to be talking a little bit about this topic and really try to keep it as practical as we can for governance professionals. What can you do to help your company or your organization embrace ESG in a fundamental way? And what are some of the very specific strategies that you can employ to help your board do the things that they need to do? So let me first introduce our panel before we get started with our conversation. I'm joined today by really three terrific panelists. We have Douglas Cha, who is president of Soundboard Governance, and he's also a fellow at Rutgers Center for Corporate Law and Governance. Doug, welcome. It's nice to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
We also have Helle Jorgensen, who is the CEO and founder of Competent Boards. Helle, it's great to see you again.
Fantastic seeing you. Thanks, Toddy.
And we also are joined today by Pamela Passman, who is on the board. She's a board director for Kinaxis, Inc. She's also the former CEO of an organization called Create, and she also is the vice chair of Ethisphere Institute. She's the former VP and deputy general counsel for global. She's the former. Let me try that again. The former corporate vice president and deputy general counsel for global corporate and regulatory affairs from Microsoft. Pamela, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, so let's go ahead and get started with our conversation today. I think just to kind of cue us up and what we really wanted to cover, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the practical side of ESG. And in particular, I'd like to start with just a definition. And I don't mean sort of a generic definition. Let's think in terms of how has ESG changed in light of everything that has happened in 2020? And in particular, how should governance professionals, general counsels, corporate secretaries, and others who are working with the board, how should they be thinking about ESG? So maybe I could pass that question first to Doug. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you define ESG.
Well, ESG has been kind of a slippery definition over the last few years. It was kind of like sustainability was a few years ago in terms of it could be something that's very rigid in terms of the E, the S, and the G, and it can be as expansive as anything you want it to be. Any kind of pet subject you have, you are able to shoehorn it into ESG. I think what, the people who really believe in ESG view it as is kind of like this holistic, integrated approach to managing your business, where you're taking into account all of these various factors, and it kind of ties into the stakeholder model of governance in terms of, with the environment, it's where the company does its business. The social, it's taking care of the community, your employees, your customers, and then governance, which is overall governance in terms of corporate governance and just governance of your own affairs. And so all of that taken in an integrated approach should result in a business that thrives over the long term and can withstand a lot of the volatility and especially crisis situations like we find ourselves in today.
I think that's very true. And Pamela, I want to turn the conversation to you, though. Having been a former general counsel, I'd like to ask you to kind of break down some of the things that Doug just shared with us from the perspective of governance professionals. How should they really be thinking about ESG right now? And in particular, given everything that's happened in 2020, has it changed?
Well, thank you, Dottie, and thank you for including me on the panel today. Well, we are certainly in unprecedented times for leading and managing companies. As we sit here in September 2020, how this pandemic will play out and for how long it will frame our reality is unknown. the unpredictable nature of our times in terms of the impact on people's health and mental well-being, employment and livelihood, education, it creates enormous anxiety. So in a time when it's difficult to even reliably predict your business trends, there's a natural reaction that'll also be difficult to expect management teams to have a systematic process for identifying the environmental, social, governance trends that are likely to impact their strategy over the short, medium, and long term. But that work has to continue. The expectations on the role of companies to provide leadership on a whole range of economic, social, health, and environmental issues, and to use their market power, not just their voice, to drive systemic change, the expectations have never been so high. And the speed in which information can quickly spread about a company has never been so fast. So I believe a greater level of engagement on ESG issues is necessary, but in a more focused way. In the short term, that focus should be on the basics or the foundational elements of your business, your employees, and the resilience of the company to operate and perform well for its employees, customers, communities, and investors. For many, the dislocation in the economy will get worse in the coming months. How companies manage staff reductions and furloughs, how they demonstrate sound business continuity, these are foundational. So, ideally, as Doug said, ideally there's an enterprise risk management framework in place that helps prioritize and focus ESG initiatives, what it communicates and to whom. Boards should be getting briefed on how senior management is addressing these foundational issues, the special actions that their companies are taking, the desired outcomes that they are trying to achieve. And boards should ensure there are multiple ways of getting a sense of the concerns of employees and other stakeholders, whether that's surveying to understand concerns and attitudes, or measuring the impact of responses the company is taking. Finally, this is a time there should be no light between what the board and senior management see as the core values of the company. Companies that focus on their purpose and live their values are proving to be more resilient in the current crisis.
So I think that's an excellent segue for me to ask this question of Helle. Helle, you work all the time with boards of directors, and in particular individual directors, providing training and coaching around these very issues through competent boards. So I'd love to know your thoughts. To what extent do you think directors are thinking about ESG in the terms that Pamela and Doug just outlined? Do you think that they're going to be thinking more about non-shareholder stakeholders in a fundamentally different way as a result of 2020?
I do, and Pamela and Doc, I would say I fully agree with you. Dottie, I think it's almost like a normal distribution curve, like a bell curve. Some are in the front. I believe some of those leaders are, like, as you said, some of those that contributing to the Competent Board Certificate Program, where we focus on ESG. So it's Jim Hagemann-Snabe. He's the chair of Siemens and AP Møller-Mærsk. It's Kathleen Taylor, the chair of the Royal Bank of Canada. She's also CPPIB, so the investors. It's people like Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever, now the chair of the International Chamber of Commerce. So I'd say we now have close to 100 leaders that are sharing their insight, their experience in this global ESG Competent Board Certificate Program. And I would, of course, say that they are at the forefront. Then I think you have a group of fast followers. And I can tell you that group is growing fast. I can see that because of the interest for actually the training program. But at the end, you have leaders that might not be in a, if I may say, position to run an ESG marathon. And I think that is what is needed. With all due respect, this is not a sprint. And to all of you listening to us today, I don't think this is like, okay, you listen to us, tick the box. I think this is about changing the mindset, about changing expectations. It's changing incentives, and it's having the insight you need to actually make those informed decisions. As Pamela was saying, the pandemic has shown us that we part of something greater, and that we have to care about others and not just ourselves. And I think a key reason for the interest in ESG and the reason why it's growing is because both the shareholder and the stakeholders are expecting businesses to play this greater and more positive role in addressing societal challenges, both, climate, you said, and social injustice. And I think the company's ESG performance is how well a company addresses those concerns. That builds trust, and it determines the social license to operate, and frankly, perhaps also the license to grow. And I think consumers are demanding higher standards of sustainability and ESG from companies. So are the employees, the talent. I think also regulators and policymakers have a vested interest actually in seeing the corporate sector increase their ESG performance to help solve the social problems, the environmental problems, workplace diversity, and frankly, I guess we should say now the economic situation we are in due to the pandemic. I think we need people to pay taxes. We need people to not be in the hospital. We do not need wildfires, droughts, floods. None of these are good for neither business or for stakeholders, or for that matter, for shareholders. So clearly the investor community are aware of this increasing body of research showing that there's a positive link between the ESG performance and the financial performance, and so the value creation. So the companies who do not appreciate this growing regard for healthy environmental, social well-being and good governance, I believe that they will suffer a backlash from the market. And I don't know if you want, but I was thinking about the latest example was the fast fashion group in the UK were accused for actually having suppliers in the UK having modern slavery, saw their share prices drop 1/3, I believe it was. And I think that retailers such as Amazon actually removed them from their site. And again, due to the pandemic, this is not a good time to be removed from the Amazon site. So, I mean, I guess just to close in this, so I think that 2020 has brought a number of ESG challenges to the public conscious, and it's become clear to, I guess, corporations as well as directors that their response to the ESG issues will affect their financial outcomes, their well-being, but also their careers. I think we will see that because of the investors are doing this, that we will have more and more directors that say, I want to, I can see the benefit of getting my ESG competences brought up to speed.
So I love everything that you've all laid out, and I want very much to agree, but I'm seeing some pushback. This panel discussion is happening just a little bit over a year of the anniversary of the Business Roundtable statement that came out last year, really calling on companies to declare a specific social purpose, and it had 184 signatories kind of at the start, and then of course many others have signed on since. But there's a book that just came out that really pushes back and says two things. One is it really didn't lead to measurable change, particularly for a lot of the companies that signed on. And secondly, maybe it's not even a good idea. You know, if companies are trying to be beholden to every stakeholder, they're kind of beholden to none because they're not focusing on any particular group. Then, of course, leading into the pandemic, we're really witnessing companies taking a leading position on pandemic response. So it's become a very complex picture. Doug, I want to know, what do you think? Do you think we're really seeing a new role emerging for companies in society, or is it just marketing spin?
Well, I think those who say that, all right, in the last year, we haven't really seen any evidence, I would say too soon. I think we all agree that we believe in long-term governance. And so it is too soon to see that. I was one of the people who said, look, once you sign this thing, you better show me that you actually mean it. Signing a piece of paper is easy. Managing your company in the way that you signed up to do, that's harder. But I didn't expect them to show instant results, because that probably would be, what the professors call illusory. And so, but what we are seeing, I think, in 2020 is the first major test, probably the biggest major test, hopefully, that any of us will see in our lifetimes in terms of how do boards and managers react to these adverse times and where are their priorities. I've been pretty impressed that most of the companies and boards have placed the focus on the well-being of their employees. And that demonstrates that they are willing to live up to their commitment. I don't hear a lot of people talking about, well, we really have to worry about EPS right now and cost cutting. It's more about the employees. And I'm not saying that all these companies are behaving like charities or kind of part of the welfare state, but you can see evidence that they are trying to help the employees to the extent that they can, and also the customers, making sure that they keep providing services that people need. On the pharmaceutical side, you see this, not just pharmaceutical, but the entire healthcare sector, the pharmacies, the distributors. They know that this is a critical time for people to get proper health care and medicine, and they have to keep producing in adverse times. And then the race to find the vaccine. I think a lot of companies realize that, obviously they have a responsibility to the world to create a vaccine kind of collectively, that competition will be good for that. And that, they understand that unlike some government officials, you need to do this in the right way. You need to have clinical testing and high standards. But they also know that they're probably not going to make much of a profit off of this because everybody is going to say, look, you should give the vaccine away for free or at cost. And they understand that there's going to be tremendous pressure to do that, and price gouging will not be tolerated.
Mm-hmm. Let's hope you're right. I really hope you're correct about that. Pamela, I want to bring you into this conversation. Feel free, by the way, to weigh in on, kind of the pushback we're seeing on the Business Roundtable. But then I'd like to shift the conversation back to some more practical strategies for companies. What's the right way for them to build trust with their key stakeholders, especially with, the employees, the customers, and the local communities, as Doug was laying out? What are the very specific ways that they should be doing this?
Great. Well, in the best of times, trust and transparency are important for a company in engaging with its key stakeholders. But certainly in the worst of times, trust and transparency are vital. They're essential. ESG really provides an opportunity, a platform, a framework, if you will, to really advance a company's trustworthiness with key stakeholders. Edelman released a special trust barometer in June. It's a follow-up to its annual release in January. And there's really some very instructive data points for companies to consider as it relates to employees and customers and the broader community. 70% of those surveyed say trusting a brand is more important today than in the past. And this was shared across different age groups, gender, and income. 81% say personal vulnerability, around their own health, their financial stability, privacy is a reason why brand trust has become more important. And 74% say a brand's impact on society is a reason why brand trust has become more important. So trust is now the make or break difference for brands. So your employees are on the front lines of building a corporate culture of trust. And boards need to be sure that leaders play an important role in demonstrating the behaviors that are expected, that incentive and reward systems are in place that build and reinforce trust, and frankly, that leaders take responsibility when things don't go as expected. And I frankly think in this time, unlike anything else we've experienced, you can't over communicate. There's got to be a bias for communication. So whether it's your customers, trust and transparency starts with your products and services. Your customers have got to be able to rely on them to do what they're supposed to do. And all customer interactions are key. And I would suggest, especially related to the protection of personal information, where so much is happening digitally. And if frankly, again, if something's not working, own it, take responsibility. And I think the reality is that most companies are going to have to go through more cost reduction initiatives. And so I think, you've really got to think about how it's going to impact your local communities. Just closing one store or closing one office can really have an impact on a local community. Local vendors of products and services will be cut back. So I think, companies really need to be transparent about the impact and how it's going to be mitigated. And boards really need to understand the local economic impact of these kinds of decisions. I would suggest that the company has got to own their messaging. They can't rely on others to announce these kinds of actions, and really be able to weave through the different actions and steps that they're taking inside the company and externally to keep it strong and to continue to build that trust.
I think that's very well said. And Helle, let's now take that to the board directly. So, we've heard about some of the very practical ways companies need to be thinking about this, which, really lays the groundwork for how governance professionals need to be involved. So what's the right role for the board in helping the company to create practical and meaningful ESG initiatives?
Well, let me start with what it's not, and some of the recent interviews I've had, where it's kind of like it's hard at the moment for some board members not to become management. And I think it's important to really give space to management to deal with the situation now. They don't need to have the board saying, we also need this, we also need this. So I think that's one. Care is another thing. And actually, Pamela, you alluded to it. I think right now it's cash is king. I'm been quoted to say many times, but at the same time, care. Care is the queen. I don't know how to put that. But if you don't show care right now, I think you're in for deep trouble. I also think, the duty of care, that is for the board of directors actually to ask, not to wait to be activated, not to wait to hear something. But this role about, when are you management, when are you the board? I think that's very, very important to respect right now, but also very difficult. But it's such, of course, when we then kind of like look a little bit further, it might be, think about establishing almost like the tone at the top, and perhaps re-articulating the purpose with this care, with this commitment to the ESG. And you spoke about the business roundtable. Many of the board directors I talked to said, well, that's actually not that much new. So of course that depends who you talk to. But I think what we need perhaps is the statement of purpose. You were saying before, you have so many different stakeholders. I think we need for the companies and the board of directors to take a role and demonstrate the company's reason for being. Not just to produce profit, but actually find solutions to the problems, the people, the planet, but you can also talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Identify those material ESG issues, the key stakeholders, and put a time frame over what management will address these material ESG issues into the strategy, the business plans, etc. And I think in that also, what are the resources? I see plenty of plans where it's like, we should do all of this, but there are no resources allocated to actually do it. That's not going to work. So then once we have these ESG initiatives, I guess, incorporated into the purpose, the values, then I think we also need to ensure that it's built into the board of directors, being that a committee to provide regular oversight of the ESG performance and the priorities, and to ensure that the directors have the needed insight. But I believe everyone at the boardroom needs to have an understanding of these issues. Of course, the board needs to be satisfied that they have the processes in place to ensure that management have the properly identified and managed all of these material ESG risk and opportunities. But again, we have the situation right now, and then we have the situation where those companies that have been ahead of the curve have a more resilient structure and they have a huge advantage right now. So I think that the leading boards also ensure that the senior leaders demonstrate these ESG competences and alignment by building it into both the mandate, but also the performance, the incentives, and the culture. And I think the culture is becoming more and more important for us to talk about. How do we get the ESG, the environment, social governance, the care built into the culture of companies? And then, of course, after you have established the right governance structure for this, ensure that you have engagement, not only with your shareholders and not only after the fact, but proactively with both shareholders and the stakeholders. I also think that everyone seeking, and Pamela, you alluded to that as well in terms of disclosure, right? We need to see some transparency. We need to see what are the material ESG topics, risk opportunities that the board believes in. What are the transition strategies? How are they going to get there? So I think, been talking about the statement of purpose, and that is a foundation. And then I think the integrated report could be a way to really showcase both internally but also externally what it is that the company do, not in a silo by silo, but in an integrated thinking within the company. And I think that is what we need right now to get these resilient companies that we are in a pandemic situation right now, but many are talking about, okay, what is the next unthinkable or perhaps thinkable situation, and how are we going to deal with that? So I think we really need to upgrade our knowledge about a lot of different areas, and really need to be clear on who are the stakeholders, what are the material issues for the stakeholders and for the companies. And the board needs to be able to oversee that, and in terms of also their duty of care.
So our time is fleeting. Thank you, Helle. I think you've laid out a bunch of very specific strategies, which is good. And I'd like to sort of stick with specific strategies because, of course, Modern Governance Summit is a gathering of current and emerging leaders in governance roles. So these are mostly governance professionals, people who are working, supporting the board of directors. And so they're really in a unique position to help the company bring about change. So Doug, I want to start with you and just ask for some tips, really practical strategies that general counsels, corporate secretaries, other governance professionals can use to help the board and company reach, some pretty lofty goals.
I think that on the very practical side for governance professionals, it's about facilitating the discussion by making it easier. I mean, all of us are dealing with a whole different mode of communication in terms of meetings. And people are dealing with, a heavier volume of meetings. I'm hearing boards, they're not meeting quarterly anymore. They're meeting monthly or weekly and getting, regular updates. And to do all of that, you need to be able to do that in some kind of an organized fashion so that the board is not getting bombarded or it's done, in a very efficient way. So what they get are in, easy manageable packages. Keep in mind, they're on other boards getting also bombarded with a lot of things. Making sure the meetings are set up and run smoothly. Technology is a big part of this. The management has to get very adept at the technology and anticipating some of the glitches that are going to happen. Just because we're dealing with so many people introduced to new technologies. So I think that, there's a big logistical element where the governance professional, whether they were trained for it or not, that's going to be a big part of their job. And so, but it's important because unless you get that right, the right kind of conversations can't happen.
Thank you for that. Pamela, I want to kind of skip ahead to you if you don't mind, because you bring this unique perspective of both being a current board member and having formerly been a general counsel. Um, where do you think we might be heading in terms of things like the different frameworks that we use for measuring and reporting on ESG initiatives, and what might be some guidance for governance professionals, especially considering that it differs so greatly from country and region? What are your thoughts there?
Well, thanks, Dottie. I guess I have a short-term and a long-term answer to the question. In the shorter term, boards and governance professionals should first focus on information needed to oversee risk, ESG risk, and execute a focused strategy in today's unpredictable environment. What are the key metrics we need on a weekly, monthly basis as we manage ESG risk during the crisis, and how we seek to actually see some ESG opportunities. And longer term, I think it's a few years out, there may be some coalescing around a few of the national and international reporting efforts. Institutional investors, I think, will play a critical role in where that goes. But I think, companies will be judged on the transparency of their ESG disclosures, the consistency on what is being reported on, and that there is continual improvement in enhancing their storytelling and meeting stakeholders' expectations. So I think boards should be asking for benchmarking against others in your industry or the business community more broadly when that's appropriate. And communication should reinforce and build trust. The information that's reported, the storytelling and the data points, they all have to demonstrate that ESG risks and opportunities are embedded in the business, in the company's strategy. And they lead to innovations. They lead to reducing costs, attracting talent, and building brand. They're really core to what you do.
Thank you. I think that's extremely helpful. And Helle, I want to just finish with you. Maybe you could share in the last minute we have available, what would you recommend governance professionals can do to best help directors stay current on these complex issues?
Very quick. I think all board of directors have their ongoing development, their training program. I think look at the skills matrix and ensure that the directors get the opportunity to actually get the ESG competences needed. I think that's good for the company. I think it's good for the directors, also those that want to be re-elected. And then, of course, for the nomination committee, look again and see every time you go out and ask for a new board member, new board of directors, what are the qualifications that you put on there? I would ask to see what kind of ESG competences do these people have as well.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to our panel. We're going to open up the floor now to questions and answers from the audience. So we'll go ahead and do that in a moment. But first, I just want to take a moment and say thank you so much to Douglas Cha, Pamela Passman, and Helle Jorgensen for this wonderful panel conversation. Thank you.